200 tankers, sitting still, going nowhere. That is not a traffic jam. That is a system beginning to break. And before we go any further, I need you to understand something. Not as a prediction, not as a theory, but as a mechanism that has already triggered 3 times in modern history, and ended the same way every single time. Here is the claim, stated as plainly as I can. If the Strait of Hormuz stays effectively shut, the way shipping data is showing right now, the global economy does not slow down. It begins to snap. Not everywhere at once, at the pressure points first. Then, like a chain reaction, everything else follows. The window before that snapping becomes irreversible, roughly 14 days. I am going to prove that number. I am going to walk you through the 4-stage pattern that makes this predictable, a pattern that has repeated across 3 different eras, 3 different actors, 3 different headlines. And at the end, I am going to give you 3 exact signals to watch. Because once you see them, every headline stops being noise. It becomes a checkpoint on a countdown you can actually read. Stay with me. Because what comes next is the part most people only understand after it is already too late. Let's start with the number that changes everything. 20 million barrels of oil per day. That is how much crude and petroleum products moved through the Strait of Hormuz in 2025. That is roughly 25% of every barrel of oil that travels by sea, anywhere on Earth, moving through a waterway that, at its narrowest point, is just 21 miles wide. Now here is the part that should make you stop. If that route is blocked, not slowed, blocked, the world's bypass capacity is somewhere between 3.5 and 5.5 million barrels per day. So for every 20 barrels that normally flow through, the world can reroute perhaps 4. The other 16 stop moving. And this is not a redundant system with a clean backup. The same region that pumps the oil also relies on the strait to export it. So the emergency option for a Hormuz closure is sitting inside the zone that a Hormuz closure makes inaccessible. The safety net is tied to the tightrope. That is not bad design. That is the natural result of a system that spent decades optimizing for efficiency instead of resilience. And that choice is what makes this moment so dangerous and so predictable. There is a 4-stage pattern that has appeared in every major energy choke point crisis in the last 70 years. Different actors, different decades, different headlines, the same machine running underneath every single time. Walk through it with me. Because once you see it, what is happening right now stops looking like chaos and starts looking like a sequence you can follow step by step. The first stage is the setup. A stable order gets built after a shock. The world standardizes around specific routes, alliances, payment systems, security assumptions. Risk gets priced down, supply chains get faster, inventories get leaner. The system starts to look like it is running perfectly because it has been trained to believe the artery will always stay open. The second stage is overextension. The system grows beyond its own margin of safety. Spare capacity gets thin. Financial leverage increases. Governments run deeper into debt. Corporations become structurally dependent on uninterrupted logistics. The system gets fast, but it gets fragile. Nobody notices because nothing has broken yet. The third stage is crisis. A shock hits the hidden joint, a choke point, a payment rail, an insurance market, an energy corridor. Decision makers respond with temporary measures, escorts, sanctions, emergency reserve releases, rationing, diplomatic pressure. But each response reveals how dependent the system already was. The crisis does not stay physical. It spreads through pricing and through expectations. The fourth stage is the reset. The rules get rewritten, sometimes through war, sometimes through forced diplomacy, sometimes through a new energy architecture or a currency realignment, but always through a repricing of risk, always through a rewrite of the assumptions the previous order was built on. Now I want to prove that pattern to you, not with theory, with history. Egypt nationalizes the Suez Canal. Britain and France still carry the posture of empire, but their monetary foundation is far weaker than their geopolitical commitments imply. The system has been built on the assumption that these arteries are protected by the order. When Egypt moves, the military response follows. But something unexpected happens. It is not the battlefield that decides the outcome. It is financial pressure. Britain does not lose because it loses a war. It loses because the chokepoint crisis exposes a gap between strategic posture and actual financial foundation, a gap that can no longer be papered over. The order resets, power shifts, new assumptions are written in, same machine, war in the Middle East, oil embargo, supply drops, prices surge, inflation bites, growth stalls, gas lines form, rationing begins. But here is what most people miss about that moment. The physical shortage, as real as it was, is not the most important part. The most important part is what it revealed. That the entire modern consumer economy, the jobs, the wages, the politics, the social trust, had been quietly built on the assumption that cheap, abundant oil would always flow. When it did not, the system did not just slow. It transmitted the shock through money, wages, politics, and an entire generation's relationship with inflation. The order resets. Energy security becomes national strategy. Central banking changes permanently. Same machine, the 1980s. The tanker war. Attacks target vessels in the Gulf, not armies, not capitals, ships, mines, missiles, insurance withdraws, risk premiums spike, and the global order faces a credibility trap it has not fully escaped since. If you claim you can keep the artery open, you must prove it every time someone tests that claim. Because in a chokepoint system, the guarantee is the product. The moment the market believes the guarantee is fake, the pricing collapses, regardless of whether a single additional barrel is physically disrupted. The region becomes permanently militarized. The risk premium never fully disappears. The system learns to live under threat, armed, tense, reactive, instead of resolving the underlying problem. Same machine, 3 eras, 3 actors, 1 pattern. Now we apply it to today. And this is where 14 days stops being a slogan and starts sounding like an alarm clock. The setup is already behind us. The world spent decades routing energy transit through Hormuz. 20 million barrels a day, 25% of seaborne trade, most of it flowing to Asia, to the import-dependent economies that power global manufacturing. That is not a route. That is an operating system, and it was built without a real backup. The overextension is already baked in. The bypass capacity cannot replace what the strait moves, and the spare production capacity that would cushion a disruption, much of it sits in the same region that needs the strait to export. The safety margin depends on the same point of failure as the baseline system. That is the definition of overextension. It already happened, quietly, over years. The crisis is not hypothetical anymore. Reporting describes the strait as effectively closed to commercial shipping. Traffic that normally runs at around 100 tankers per day has evaporated. 200 tankers are stranded. Insurance has withdrawn. Risk premiums have reached levels operators are calling no-go zone territory. That is not a slowdown. That is a supply chain snapping in real time. And when tankers stop moving, oil does not slow down. It becomes trapped inventory. Supply exists, but it is unusable. That gap between physical existence and physical usability is where crises actually live. The financial environment makes everything worse. Global debt sits at roughly $348 trillion. The system is already operating on thin tolerance for price shocks. When oil spikes, inflation pressure rises. When inflation pressure rises, rate cuts get delayed. When rates stay high, refinancing stress grows. And when that stress spreads simultaneously across multiple countries, which is what a global supply shock produces, the crisis does not stay in the energy sector. It travels. Pakistan, as one example, is reported to have roughly 26 days of fuel reserves under current conditions. That is one country. But procurement teams in every import-dependent nation are running the same internal calculation right now, looking at the same shipping data, the same insurance signals, the same risk premiums. They may not announce it, but the behavior follows whether or not the announcement comes. So where does 14 days actually come from? It is not a headline. It is a systems estimate based on how modern energy infrastructure actually fails. The first days are shock and pricing. Markets react, futures move, spot prices spike. That is now. By the end of the first week, inventories become visible constraints. Emergency reserve releases get announced. Export restrictions appear. Rationing signals surface in the most exposed countries. The system begins fragmenting between those who have supply and those who do not. By around 2 weeks, if flows have not normalized, the behavior changes character. It stops being reactive and becomes structural. State-level panic procurement begins. Bidding wars emerge for available cargoes. Manufacturing costs climb. Food logistics costs climb because diesel moves food. Aviation costs climb because jet fuel moves people and cargo. For import-dependent economies, the cost of doing business rises sharply, not as a temporary disruption, but as a new baseline. That is when coordination breaks. And coordination, once broken, does not restore with a press release. You need credible security guarantees. You need insurance markets to re-enter. You need traffic to normalize. You need policy signals that are consistent and predictable. That process takes time. And the longer the disruption runs before it begins, the longer and harder the recovery becomes. The 14 days is not a simultaneous doomsday clock for every country. It is the window where the global system begins losing its ability to coordinate, and where the reset, in whatever form it takes, becomes unavoidable. Before I give you the 3 signals, I want to kill 3 assumptions that will wreck your thinking if you hold on to them. The first is that military strength overrides chokepoint arithmetic. It does not. The strongest military on Earth cannot instantly restore commercial confidence if insurers and operators have already pulled out. The system is not run by flags. It is run by incentives and liability calculations, and those do not respond to press conferences or carrier groups the way maps suggest they should. The second is that the modern services economy is somehow insulated from energy reality. It is not. A digitized economy still moves food on diesel, still flies on jet fuel, still manufactures plastics, chemicals, and fertilizers from hydrocarbons. The services economy is a layer sitting on top of a physical economy, and the physical economy runs on oil. The third is the most seductive, that technology will route around the problem. Technology does not remove choke points. It often concentrates them. GPS jamming, drone threats, insurance algorithms, port congestion. Technology makes disruptions faster and more contagious, not slower and more contained. Now the 3 signals. These are what you actually watch to understand where this goes. The first is shipping normalization, not statements, movement. Tanker transits through the strait, insurance availability for Gulf cargoes, traffic density returning to baseline. When the artery functions again, the system calms quickly. When it does not, every single day compounds the stress. The second is strategic stock posture. Countries inside the IEA framework are structured around emergency stockholding, typically 90 days of net imports. Coordinated emergency releases are one of the few tools capable of buying time in a severe disruption. Watch whether releases are announced, how large they are relative to the gap, and whether spot markets respond. A release that does not move spot prices is a signal the market does not believe the disruption will be short. The third is policy behavior in import-dependent countries. Work-from-home mandates, fuel rationing language, emergency subsidy expansions, conservation orders. Those are not precautions. Those are early symptoms of a government preparing for scarcity. And governments do not prepare for scarcity unless the people doing the internal modeling are seeing something that has not yet appeared in the public headlines. Here is what this entire framework comes down to. The world built a global energy system with a single critical artery, then optimized that system so thoroughly the artery became larger than any backup. then layered $348 trillion of debt on top of that structure, making the whole thing exquisitely sensitive to exactly the kind of shock now in progress. A collapse in this context is not the moment oil disappears from the earth. It is the moment the system loses its ability to deliver predictable supply at predictable prices. When that predictability breaks, planning breaks, margins break, monetary policy breaks, and political stability in the most exposed countries breaks alongside it. The machine does not snap because people panic. It snaps because the math runs out of options. Watch the three signals. Track the pattern. Understand that what you are watching is not random chaos. It is a sequence running exactly the way this sequence has always run. In every era it has appeared. The next part of this series maps what happens after the 14-day window, how a choke point crisis becomes a monetary event, how shortages move through supply chains, and what signals separate a controlled stabilization from a full reset of global risk architecture. Subscribe now, because that is the video where the mechanism reaches its final stage, and that is the stage where the decisions that matter most either get made or get missed.